Tarzan wasn't a ladies' man. He just came along and scooped him up under his arm like that. Quick as a cat in the jungle. Clark Kent, now there was a real gent. He would not be caught sitting around in no jungle's keep. Dumb as an ape, doing nothing. I got a comment on a recent video that said nobody likes a pretentious film critic, so instead of drinking tea today, I'm drinking a beer. But is it a fruity Belgian white? Who knows? Maybe I really am a pretentious film critic. Ooh. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, look, I think it's fine if you're excited for the new Superman movie, and I think it's extra fine if you want to take the release of this new movie to clown on any right-wing heads who are complaining about James Gunn politicizing this character who was already an allegory for the immigrant molded to embody the best in American values by two Jewish authors. I think it's fine if you want to take an opportunity to excoriate the sorts of idiots who, especially at this time in American life where a fascist government is rapidly expanding the police state in order to round up, detain, concentrate, brutalize, torture immigrants, I think it's fine if you want to take this popular movie as a moment where you can advocate for a more humanitarian view of the fundamental rights of any person who is a migrant or a person descended from recent migrants. And of course, that humanitarian value being non-exclusive, which is to say, regardless of whether you're a citizen or you're a legal resident, you're mixed documented, you're undocumented, no one deserves to be treated that way. And it's a really bad sign if any of us are treated that way. So yeah, but if all you're doing is arguing about an interpretation of a big homogenized Hollywood CGI fantasy blockbuster that, for whatever its allegorical significance, is by its very nature within a system of mass media consumption and thus necessarily is intended to be advertised to as big and indiscriminate of an audience as possible, and is thus inevitably going to be the sort of movie where, just like with every major motion picture about Superman leading up to this one, whatever political significance it has is just going to glide over the phone-distracted, smooth and passive and complacent brains of consumers looking for entertainment and not art that makes them question things. If all you're doing is fighting an eternal dying battle against the inevitability that all of these four-quadrant targeted fantasy movies that receive far more funding and are promoted far more than, I don't know, actual dramatic films about the migrant experience, or even maybe contemporary, smaller films made by migrants or people descended from recent migrants, maybe, just maybe, you should be taking this as the latest abject lesson that the problem isn't just exclusively a fringe minority of the loudest idiots on Twitter and propagandists on Fox News who are trying to get you riled up in bad faith. It's not actually tangibly connected to cinema as an art form that exposes you to people from all over the world and different ways of seeing the world and humanizing those that you perceive as being somehow fundamentally alien to you. And I'm not even saying you can't even be an adult and see the big kids movie ever again. I'm just saying maybe balance it out a little bit. Just a little bit, balance it out a little bit, doing the balance it out a little bit dance. But yeah, I am in the sort of advantageous geographical position where I can just decide, yeah, even after being on my feet for 8 hours at work in a distribution facility covered in granulated sweat particles, I'm just going to head straight into Brooklyn so that I can patronize for the very first time the Rose Cinemas of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which, while I have been keeping an eye on this venue for a while, noticing that they have a really great programming schedule when it comes to exhibiting oftentimes really obscure films, especially not only by filmmakers of color from the United States, but also films from Africa and the rest of the global South that, is typically ignored even by the most established of independent distributors and exhibitors of international films in the West. Over the past few days, the Bamrose Cinemas has also been programming a showcase of contemporary Arab cinema, new and recent films, many of which do not even have secure US distribution, if they ever will have them, from nations as diverse as Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Palestine, and in the case of the film I decided to see this past Thursday, Somalia. This is another minor point I've brought up before in this series. One of the most important first steps you can take if you already know you love movies but really want to expand your horizons as far as the types and variety of films you are able to see, not just at home but on the big screen. You have to stop thinking in terms of individual movies and start researching specific theaters and exhibitors and specialty and boutique venues. You have to think in terms of supporting the establishments that bring those movies to you. Because yeah, while I was in fact quite interested in seeing the latest James Gunn written and directed Superman, something that I really want to stress about the new movie diary is that I want to strike an equitable balance between addressing contemporary, mainstream, popular cinema while also doing my level-headed best as just some workaday schmuck who is out here talking about the sorts of movies and more generally the types of venues and theaters that show the sorts of movies that many people who would be very interested in seeing them have no idea are even out there, have no idea they are even able to see in theaters when they have the opportunity. So the topic of this very proud episode of the New Movie Diary is a little Somali debut by Somali-Austrian writer-director Mo Haraway, which I am now super grateful to the Bam Rose Cinemas for having programmed on a Thursday evening in the early days of this showcase of contemporary Arab language cinema, because I'm going to be completely straight with you guys. I went into this exhibition completely blind, had no idea what I was going to see other than that I just didn't want to spend another weekend with a top-line mainstream blockbuster after being disappointed and underwhelmed so consistently throughout the year. I went in completely blind to this movie, and I ended up seeing the best new film I've seen all year. In neorealist style, The Village Next to Paradise stars first-time actors Ahmed Ali Farah, Ahmed Mohamed Salaban, and Anad Hamad Ibrahim. They portray the principal ensemble family in this story set in a windswept seaside village ironically named Paradise. These characters are, respectively, the father, Mahmargad, his recently divorced sister, Aroelu, and Mamagad's only son, Siga. I am absolutely butchering a lot of names today. It's one of those butcher a lot of names episodes. Sorry. Mamagad works a semi-regular job as a driver for a small goods shipping company, transporting everything from livestock at times to alcohol and other elements to hotels in the city to which his village serves as basically a poor suburb. But Mamagad's primary form of self-employment is as a gravedigger for individuals who either do not have the money or the family or local clan support to bury loved ones, especially those who are killed in ever more frequent violent events such as suicide bombings and other terroristic actions committed by various unnamed, though obviously the heavily implied Al-Qaeda-aligned Al-Shabaab militant organization that has been a primary antagonist in a contentious civil war with the transitional federal government of Somalia. Just ask me how much Wikipedia I've had to quickly brush over before this review. Mamagad also very often buries the civilian casualties of drone strikes largely perpetrated by the TFG-aligned US forces actively targeting and attempting to neutralize al-Shabaab. And at the intersection of these two contemporary political phenomena, the deaths of civilians from terrorist attacks, and the deaths of both civilians and militants from drone strikes. This is even how Moharawe chooses to introduce us to Mamagad as a character. After an archival bit of news footage documenting the killing of a key al-Shabaab militant leader through a US drone strike, Moharawe segues into a dramatic introduction to Mamagad in which he is paid to dig a grave for a John Doe being delivered to him by a primary doctor at a
local hospital, that John Doe being heavily implied as being the anonymous remains of this very same real-life al-Shabaab leader. And it's crucial to really take in all the implied variables of this scene, not just from the perspective of how Haraway, as a writer and director, is dramatically conveying the socio-political backdrop of Somalia, this very much underdeveloped nation that has basically always been in a transitional phase since earning its de jure independence from colonial rule all the way back in the late 60s, presently still in the grips of a protracted civil war since 2009, to say nothing of other factors alluded to by the film in terms of not so much Somalia proper, but the Somali people's ongoing so-called post-colonial exploitation, whether in terms of illegal dumping of chemicals by other nations or illegal fishing in national waters by other nations. But it's not just the socio-political backdrop. You really got to focus on the interaction between Mahmoud and the other characters in this scene. I think it says a lot that this doctor from the local hospital is basically just independently for himself is able to round up some help to give this John Doe a proper Islamic burial, that even in the midst of this civil unrest and ambiguity about who it really is based on whatever region you're in, whether you're in a village or a more modern city, who is really in charge and who really claims to be the guarantors of the Somalian identity, but especially how the entrenched historical constant of Sunni Islam is in Somalia, that Mo Haraway, as a writer-director, portrays it as being taken for granted that, yeah, this doctor from a local hospital doesn't really care who this John Doe is or whether he was a civilian or a terrorist when he was killed. He's also just kind of a good Muslim, and he has a sense of this dead person being owed a humanitarian and holy burial consistent with Islamic values. Whereas besides digging the grave himself, our first real introduction to Mahmoud is when he gets really mad at this doctor because he's only able to pay him half of what was agreed upon, and at the end of the conversation, Mahmoud is like, off, never call me again. I should probably also mention that during this entire scene, in the background, we also see a small band of construction or social workers themselves using a bulldozer for what is progressively implied to be the site of a mass grave, or at least a spot for a similar kind of development. It really is rather exciting how much about the slowly unfurling social and character study Haraway is able to condense into just this first scene, because even just that element of the bulldozer turns out to be a rather bitterly ironic reverberation of a theme that I think even a lot of Westerners can immediately recognize, which is like, oh, well, this is kind of horrific, but also kind of quaint, but also kind of even more horrific for how quaint it is. This is an example of the theme of economic and technological modernity displacing traditional forms of labor and social work. That's one of the most funny blink and you miss it jokes that Haraway buries in the script when Abuelo, Marmagard's sister, describes Marmagard's occupation as social worker, which is not accurate, but also, again, in the framing of this very simple but very layered and complex neo-realistic dramatic scene, is not entirely inaccurate. Like, yeah, in the midst of all this civil war and foreign intervention regularly killing militant and civilian alike, here comes this bulldozer to completely displace the traditional social work of the individual gravedigger who used to be able to have a nice little supplementary income serving the needs of the community by helping to bury people who didn't have anyone else to give them a proper burial. But really hone in on how Mahmoud responds to only being able to be paid, at least in the moment, half of what he was promised. Because even though the doctor is like, look, I can get you the rest of the money later, but I just need more time. This is all charity. Nobody knows who this guy is. We're just burying him because we feel weird about him not receiving a proper Islamic burial. In response to this, Mahmoud is just like, off, don't talk to me, I've had it with you. And as the social and character study of the village next to paradise unfurls, the thing we start to internalize is that this is actually a very important character detail for Mahmoud, which is that he's kind of just a huge dick. And you get a sense of that as the narrative goes on, and in parallel to what we might say is the primary drama of Mahmagad and his son Sigal, is this parallel story with Mahmagad's sister Awelu, who is recently divorced because for whatever reason she isn't able to have a child with her ex-husband, and she isn't willing to allow her ex-husband to take a second wife. And so her primary motive is to get a loan from a bank so that she can buy a small makeshift storefront to start her own local tailoring business. And as such, Owelo's constant struggle is making deals with people so that she can get the money she needs to start that business, which means that in the context of a society where basically everybody is broke, means that even when people owe money to her, she can never get the entire amount of what she is owed, at least on time. And while there is certainly an element of the exploration and expectations of gender in this conservative Islamic society, the fact that Owelo, as a woman, doesn't have the ability to just tell people who owe her money to just off or whatever, Owelo is operating in a context in which, far from there being an expectation of debts being paid back on time and in full, the norm is that because everybody is broke and basically everybody owes money to somebody or other, the social norm is that you don't pay back a debt on time and in full, and that there is even a kind of a sense of social etiquette that is built around that idea that in a society where everybody is broke and everybody basically owes money to everybody else, the norms of social etiquette is actually that you don't endeavor to pay back your debts on time and in full because it injures a sense of social cohesion and interdependence. This isn't about you liking your neighbor, it's about you recognizing that even if you've got a problem with your neighbor and even if he owes you money, you sort it out with the chief of your clan, or you have the chief of your clan talk to the chief of another clan, or you go with a man so the chief of another clan will take you seriously, blah, blah, blah. But there is still this shared sense of value that, look, you may not like the person who owes you money, but since we're all in the same boat, you can maybe just intuitively understand the perspective of the person who owes you money, because you probably owe somebody money too. Or you probably need something in a short while, and you might not want that money back too soon if you can make another deal with this person you don't necessarily like. And that is the world of social etiquette and bond making in which Owelo operates, regardless of whether or not she would prefer to have all the money she needs as soon as possible to establish herself as a free, independent woman. So then you contrast this with Mahmagad, who is telling this guy, who is even saying, look, I'll get you the money when I can. Everybody is broken in debt. Mahmagad is just like immediately willing to tell this guy, all I care about is the money right now. This relationship with you socially means nothing to me. Like in his semi-regular job as a driver for this shipping company, Mahmagad is in a relationship with a guy who does not even live in the village. He's in a relationship with a guy where he will be paid always on time and what he is owed unless his boss finds some way to say there was some infraction on a deal, some last minute demand he makes that you have to do this or I blame you for that and I'm not going to pay you as much if you don't satisfy this need. The modern economy is something that is very dispiriting and alienating because every time Mahmagad or anybody else takes a job from this guy, it's always, you did the job, and if you didn't do it up to my expectations, not only am I not going to pay you the money I said I would give you, I'm going to give you even less. And each time I pay you less, I'm actually closing the social door. There is no social relationship. There is no premise of social cohesion. It is strictly about my financial power over you. And I don't really care what happens to you. I don't need you anymore. You are fundamentally expendable. You wonder how a guy like Mamagad starts to think the way he does, even when everybody else is just kind of, they go through the motions, they're more polite, they don't swear nearly as much as he does. Even in the name of this village, Paradise, and the title of Haraway's film, The Village, next to Paradise, is this an ironic title, or is this an entirely earnest proposition that as hard as life is for these characters, there is a way in which they are closer to a real sense of shared humanity and social cohesion that I, in the context of a United States that is rapidly deteriorating into atomized, cynical, self-interest motivated fascism, that I can hardly even really imagine it, which ends up being certainly the case for Marmargad as what ends up being the primary dramatic thrust of the village next to Paradise, recognizing that he is rapidly losing the ability to support himself and his son through the traditional means at his disposal, but also realizing the opportunities that his son might have if he were educated at a comparatively expensive private boarding school in the city. And I'm leaving out a lot of interim plot details here. This is a very dense film dramatically and socially that I'm really hesitant to give away too much because I want anybody who has the luck, the joy of seeing it to have a similar kind of experience to the one I had. In the context of this story, Marmargad is not a good person. Besides his social faux pas as far as the payment of debts, he also literally steals money from his sister's cash box, and even when he's working as a driver will be admonished by his employer for picking up nomadic hitchhikers. And before you say, well, Ian, what's wrong with Marmargad deciding he doesn't care what his boss says, he's going to pick up people in need if he feels like it? Really pay attention to that part of the drama, because where Haraway is going with it is going to end up really flipping the script on your sense of one of the few morally virtuous qualities that you think Marmargad has, and expose a layer in the socially violent context of contemporary Somalia. It's really going to expose a new layer of his cynicism and his moral complacency, if not his immorality. The only real virtue that Marmargad seems to be able to extend is to the betterment of his own son, and I hope I'm not telling on myself too much in that when I was getting my hair cut this weekend and I was talking to my hairdresser, shout out to Emma, love you, sweetie, I was giving a much more spoiler-heavy explanation of this movie, especially the stuff about Marmargad and Seagal and the drama between the single father and his son. And as I was explaining what happens as far as Seagal being compelled to attend this private boarding school and Marmargad's basically showing the one virtuous quality that he has throughout this study of his character, one of the ladies getting their hair done next to me said, "That sounds like a very depressing movie." And what I said to her was, that was actually one of the most life-affirming movies I've ever seen. Fundamentally, I think The Village Next to Paradise is a movie about the nature of love and what even the most disreputable and cynical seeming among us are capable of doing in its name. This is not love as we typically see it, especially in Western cinema, in terms of it being about this high romantic feeling and sense of displays of extravagant giving and virtue. This is a movie about the nature of love in a very tangible, material, secure, and devotional sense that is not only not asking or begging for attention and validation, but is quite the opposite. What you see transpire in the social and character study with Marmargad at its center is a kind of love that almost begs for the opposite, to be ignored, to go unacknowledged, so that what you are willing to do in the name of love will bear fruit without distraction by what you're doing itself. I think The Village Next to Paradise is an absolutely amazing film, nothing short of a minor masterpiece as far as a debut for Mo Haraway himself, so I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5, only to break my own heart in reporting I really don't know if I can be confident in saying that a lot of my audience is going to be able to see it. As of now, as far as I can discover or ascertain, The Village Next to Paradise has not secured any distribution in the United States, whether in terms of a limited theatrical run or just as far as getting released direct to streaming. And I'm almost worried that if it does go to streaming, it might be behind the paywall of a really boutique art house and international film streaming service, so all I can really do is cross my fingers and hope it comes to a Tubi near you. So you might be asking, well, Ian, why are you getting on this soapbox and praising to the high heavens this new movie that you're not even confident that I'm going to be able to see? And what the does this have to do with Superman and the immigrant narrative and all that smack you were talking at the beginning of this entry, you smug, pretentious, motherfucking son of a... To put it as simply as I can, besides the fact that I hope I did a good enough job of impressing my viewer, that this is just going to be one of those entries that isn't so much about the individual film, as great as it was about the experience of a film far off the beaten path and what it actually takes to support and be a part of a cinematic culture where a movie like this one, as great as this one even has the chance to get in front of as many eyes as possible. But there's also an extent to which I think I can bring us right back to my point about what I see as basically the pointless online defense of Superman from the typical gaggle of cynical, bad faith, right-wing media dunderheads who are going to try to take James Gunn to task for holiest of terrors, politicizing and making woke this character who has always been an allegory for the immigrant experience. Here's the thing, guys. Yes, Superman has always been an allegory for the immigrant experience, but he's also always been an allegory for exceptionalism in the immigrant experience, as far as it glorifies that same sense of exceptionalism in the United States. If you're a parent of a child who wants to engage their kids civically and artistically, if you want to use this spectacular character as a vector for getting them to understand that, yes, even people who come from far off and strange places, they can be just as American and even exemplify national values more than native-born people, I think that's great, and you should do that. But if you're an adult, and even a childless adult, you are only and often ever waging these battles in the spectacular context of fantasy stories that are all about extolling exceptional qualities of immigrant characters. Which is to say, just like those right-wing shitheads, when we do that, we ourselves are only getting this animated about something that we think reflects a sense of national exceptionalism, but we're not actually engaged in the humanity of the immigrant experience in non-fantastical, non-allegorical terms. Moharaway himself, the creator of this amazing Somali film, he was himself a migrant from Somalia to Europe. He went there when he was 18 so that he could advance his artistic and filmmaking career, which, despite the fact that Somalia does actually have a pretty robust communications and entertainment industry, that's pretty much what he had to do to have the sort of career and make the sorts of dramatically centered, non-fantastical stories that he wanted to make about his home country, about his people, about what he can represent as a migrant and an artist without concern for what panders to and appeals to the fixations of Western audiences, only on what is exceptional about migrants in terms of what it does for our own nation and sense of national identity. Like, I'm sorry, but the immigrant experience as an exceptional reflection of whatever land, usually quite begrudgingly, accepts them, that is not a progressive narrative. It is itself a very reactionary narrative that highlights only what is exceptional and spectacular, not what is human. The crisis being faced by migrants and the descendants of recent migrants in the United States today is not that nobody recognizes their exceptional traits or talents. I've got bad news for anybody. The crisis they're facing is that they are being dehumanized. It's that we don't accept them as human. It is that the average migrant is inevitably going to be a mediocre and oftentimes a decidedly flawed individual who, just like Mahatma in The Village Next to Paradise, if you got to know them personally, I don't care how progressive you think you are, you yourself might be tempted to write them off as a cynical, complacent, ignorant who doesn't deserve anything special as regards your own sense of what it takes to be a part of the spectacular pageant of national identity that only exists in your head, but has nothing to do with what people should deserve regardless of whether or not they are not only not exceptional, but deeply flawed. They're just human. Personally, I don't care about the exceptionalism of any individual recent migrant. I don't care about the projection of exceptionalism of my own country, and I don't care about the exceptionalism of any so-called native-born English speakers. I don't care about any of those things as much as I care about a shared sense of humanity, and as an adult, you aren't going to get to that point if you're constantly preferring the vision of exceptional spectacle portrayed by, like, Superman. We have to be able to expand our horizons to incorporate humanity in a sense that we recognize that it doesn't matter if someone is exceptional. It doesn't even matter if they are kinda a huge dickhead, because most people are mediocre dickheads, and whether we like it or not, our project should be defending the humanity of those mediocre dickheads from the sort of self-infatuated, overly propagandized cretins who are only concerned with the projection of their own sense of exceptionalism. I'm not saying you can't see the new Superman. I'm just saying maybe once you do, maybe just trying to watch a movie made by or about migrants or the descendants of recent migrants, real ones, not exceptional individuals, but flawed, mediocre human beings who are not performing a shallow, reactionary spectacle of exceptionalism for us. Here, I'll even rattle off some recent ones. Sing J. Lee's The Accidental Getaway Driver, that was this year. Sean Wang's Didi, that was last year. And Daniel Polliner's Come Find Me. All good to great films that I'd have to wager, just taking for granted, together probably say a lot more about the migrant experience in the United States right now than a fucking Nietzschean holdover from the late 30s. With that, though, I'm going to be signing off. Thank you so much for sticking through this video. Please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.